I am guessing everyone who listens to this show considers themselves, like me, an environmentalist and cares about the planet. You believe in science, a shocking notion. So you get that there's a climate change emergency. We know we have to do some pretty radical stuff to keep this spaceship habitable for generations to come. Here's the problem. There isn't enough real thought by environmentalists and politicians with numbers to go along with the thinking how to take care of workers who will be hurt by the closing down of the fossil fuel industry. It's a big deal that I come back to a lot and have written a lot about, and I take it up again today. This is Jonathan Tassini, and it's great to have you with us for our show for December 16th, 2020. Speaking of workers, if you'd like to support the labor that goes into this podcast, go over to workinglife.org, look for the podcast tab, and click over there, and you will see a link to Patreon where you can sign up as a one-time sponsor or a monthly supporter. Or you can do the same thing by using ActBlue. Go over to ActBlue and look for Working Life with Jonathan Tassini, and there you also can become a one-time sponsor or monthly sponsor. Now, every worker I know in whatever industry cares about the planet. And I'm sure that a large majority of those folks do believe that climate change is caused by human activity. Grasping that is not contrary to also being worried to death you won't be able to pay the bills if your coal mine shuts down, or a refinery stops production, or the truck you drive to deliver food to people has to be all electric. Don't worry, politicians and environmentalists say there will be a quote-unquote just transition for workers in the fossil fuel industries, which would mean income support and job retraining as they see it. Joe Biden has plenty of language in his campaign positions calling for high-paid union jobs in the post-carbon world, and he promises, quote, "We're not going to leave any workers or communities behind." And that's a quote directly from his position paper on climate change. Now, I'm not picking on Biden truthfully here because I found this to be true about the overwhelming number of well-meaning proposals. When you dig down into his plans and promises, and just about every major proposal that I've ever read, everyone seems to want to do it on the cheap, meaning giving those workers income that won't last for more than a few years and training them for jobs that will pay a whole lot less, especially when you demand workers move from a good union job to an industry that is non-union. And bravo for Biden for at least specifically saying union jobs, because he, or people who wrote the positions for him, perhaps even directly written by union folks, he understands that high wages only come when people have a union. But beyond general feel-good rhetoric, there's way too much vagueness in what workers will actually face in terms of what those proposals are offering. I'm not suggesting climate change advocates devise these plans and are intentionally devious. I just think they have no clue about what a blow it is for a coal miner, for example, in West Virginia, to lose a decent middle-class job in places where there really are no alternatives for a job, except maybe for a minimum wage job at the dollar store or local market. I don't think climate change activists really understand that almost all retraining programs have largely failed, whether those were programs to deal with the end of the Cold War, when several million defense industry workers lost their jobs, or the retraining programs offered to those who lose jobs because of horrendous trade deals like NAFTA. These plans failed, in my opinion, not just because there was not enough money to make the programs real, but because people are being retrained for jobs that either don't exist or pay much less than what a current good job might pay, especially if you're talking about a union job, which usually comes with some benefits. This won't be cheap, and it shouldn't be cheap. Millions of workers had virtually no say in national energy decisions that for decades gave subsidies to fossil fuel industries and shoved alternative energy to the bottom. If they are being told their current job is going away, they should be paid in full for their working lives either as a standalone income support or money to top off their pay from a likely new lower wage job to what they had earned, as an example, if they were mining coal. This is not just a moral thing to do, it's damn smart economics. Whether we like it or not, 2/3 of the economy today is powered by consumer spending. And yes, that's a topic for another day because the buy obsession also hurts the planet because we shouldn't be producing so much consumer crap. So a worker making, say, half the wages she or he made simply won't have enough money to spend. Hell, she or he might not even be able to make basic payments like rent, food, utilities, not to mention buy a new pair of pants or go to a movie. Here's a second, as important part of a robust, just transition process that I don't hear environmentalists talk about enough. The coal-fired power plant that shuts down wasn't just paying workers' wages, it was also paying property taxes, which in many places is how schools get funded. So just to make one obvious connection, if you want future kids to go to schools that have books and have enough money to fix ceilings, then you want a huge amount of money to be at the ready to replace what the power plant contributed into the economy. And you can extrapolate that example in thousands of other ways. Now, just one final point for today before I bring in my guest. This really is about resetting the power between capital and corporations on the one hand and workers and communities on the other hand. This isn't the first time a bunch of workers have been the sacrificial lambs because of a corporate decision. It has happened for decades, thousands and thousands of times. The difference here is the scope. In the past, a transition might be one industry, like defense, as I mentioned before, or even one community where a company goes belly up. This time, we are talking about the entire economy because no corner of the economy will not feel the effects of the decarbonization agenda. And that's what's exciting to me. There really is an opportunity to reimagine the rights of people in an economy and challenge the prevailing free market ideology that has been dominant for decades. And we can build coalitions between workers and communities and rebuild the labor movement through this just transition fight. So, okay, on to Europe. The just transition debate in Europe is both similar to ours and not the same. It's not the same for some key reasons. Unions are stronger, but perhaps not as strong as, say, 20 years ago. Healthcare is not tied to what job you happen to have. It's a right, not a privilege in Europe. And in most nations in Europe, there is a component of a national pension plan. So you don't have to pray like you do here that the stock market is doing well enough when you retire so that your IRA will give you enough money to live on. And many governments, Germany for example, have already put a number on a just transition effort. That said, in Europe too, like here, it's not at all a certainty that workers will see what I call a high bar solution, meaning a commitment to make all workers whole for their entire working lives for any income they might lose if they are forced to switch jobs. To dig into this a bit more, it's a pleasure to have Adrian Thomas on the show. Adrian is a research scientist at the Luxembourg Institute of Socioeconomic Research, and he's focused on employment relations and the social and environmental dimensions of sustainable development. That's a mouthful. I was interested in chatting with Adrian after reading a recent article he co-wrote called Trade Unions and Climate Change: The Jobs versus Environment Dilemma. Now, Adrian, one of the things that's interesting in looking at your paper is the way in which you have divided what you observe among unions, essentially dividing into three buckets, if I can use that term, the way in which unions are positioning themselves over the question of just transition. And you describe those, if I can say, they oppose the notion of just transition. And as you point out, and I'll ask you to explain this, that's not a lot. Then there's a huge bucket of folks that are hedging their bets and hedging their position. And then there are some who are actually outright supporting the notion of just transition. So explain that in a few words if you can.
Yeah, we have basically looked at European trade unions and at how they position themselves towards decarbonization policies. Do they support or oppose them? And what we found is that there's a small minority of unions within the European Union who oppose climate change mitigation policies, who want to stick to their traditional industries and who are not ready to go on the path of decarbonization, and who even might challenge the science on climate change. Then we have also a number of unions which take proactive positions on decarbonization, which set out policy proposals in the field of decarbonization, and who basically take a proactive stance towards decarbonization. And then you have the largest number of unions, especially in manufacturing industry and in energy production, which take positions which consist of hedging. These unions do not oppose the science on climate change. They do not deny the need for climate change mitigation, but they are reluctant to support ambitious policy proposals, and they basically try to slow things down and have a tendency to oppose environmental protection and job interests of their members.
And you use the term hedging. So the way they do that, I gather from reading your paper and for what you described, and I guess I'm focusing on the hedging because that's the largest number of unions, I get the sense, that they aren't going to come out publicly and say, we don't think there is a problem around climate change. We don't think it's an issue, but they just try to slow down the process in terms of the mitigation efforts. And to build on that, isn't that in some way understandable? And I'm a little bit reflecting the US reality that when you're a union representing lots of workers, you don't see a plan within this whole decarbonization effort that really is going to make sure that your members can survive, meaning make a living in some way if they give up their jobs.
Yeah, of course, unions in the European Union, just as in the United States, have been losing members over the last decades. They have been losing influence. And so they need, of course, to look after the interests of their membership. And their present membership is often regrouped mainly in the public sector, but also in manufacturing industry. And this industry is, of course, likely to be affected by decarbonization. Car producers are likely to be affected by the switch to electrification. Steel production is, of course, likely to be affected by decarbonization. And so there's, of course, a tendency to represent the interests of their membership. But at the same time, unions in Europe are confronted with a youth movement which asks for stronger climate action. They are confronted with public policies which support more and more decarbonization. And so there's also a strong pressure not to oppose climate mitigation policies, because by opposing climate mitigation policies, unions would also risk paying a high price. So they are, in a sense, in a difficult situation. And I think that's one of the reasons why unions are looking for public support for just transition measures, are looking for public support for retraining of the workforce and for industrial policies.
So to use a parallel in the United States, and we're talking now mostly about unions as organizations, but if you think about the average rank and file members, and there's probably not a single industry that isn't going to be touched by obviously climate mitigation efforts. But I'm thinking of the places that I went to in the United States, in West Virginia, in the coal mining towns, for example, where if you don't have a coal mining job, then basically you're going to work at a 7-Eleven, a dollar store, and you're going to have below minimum wage life standard. And that's a frightening thing for folks who live in those communities to face. So their outward reaction is to, I'm going to oppose this as much as possible, because the bottom line is, I'm thinking about my kitchen table when I'm trying to pay the bills. So I'm wondering if there's a parallel reality in Europe, generally speaking, that you see these folks in communities that basically see no other options.
Yeah, of course. I think there's of course the issue of coal with a country like Poland, which is strongly dependent on coal production and on coal for electricity generation. And you have a number of Central and Eastern European countries which have still a lot of manufacturing industry, of also heavily polluting manufacturing industry. And of course, these regions will be affected more strongly by decarbonization than regions more in Western Europe, which have already deindustrialized to a large degree. So the more you have a workforce dependent on manufacturing, the more you risk being impacted, and the more you have an energy mix dependent on fossil fuels, the more you will be affected. And we see this, of course, in the positions taken by trade unions, with the Polish mine workers unions, which are of course opposed to climate mitigation policies, and there are clearly sectoral reasons for this. Yeah.
Well, if we step out from mining, I didn't want to necessarily use that as the only example, because as I mentioned before, this touches essentially every single sector, certainly in manufacturing, but I would argue also in the public sector area. And I think, again, I'm using the United States as the example mostly, and there are big differences, obviously, between Europe and the United States in the way which they treat workers. But if you're the average person here and you're looking at this, average person meaning someone working in industry that's going to be affected by decarbonization efforts, the reality is that, first of all, in the United States, we have a very low minimum wage. We don't have a national pension system. As you know, healthcare is not a national system, unlike Europe, which therefore has some advantages for workers in terms of bottom line costs. What is it going to cost me to make sure my family can survive in the future if I have to change jobs? So the fear is real. And my criticism of the environmental movement, and I'm an environmentalist at heart myself, has been that there's not been really a serious discussion and a serious advocacy of the kind of money that you need in a just transition fund, which you reference in your paper.
Yeah, I think there has been some change, at least in Europe, in this domain, because now we have had in France in 2018, 2019, the Yellow Vest movement, which was basically a grassroots revolt against tax raises on fuels. And this has, of course, sharpened the consciousness for the need to address the social implications of decarbonization, for addressing the social effects of decarbonization and the effect of decarbonization on inequalities. And I think we are seeing, at least in Europe, we are seeing alliances between environmental movements and trade unions. Of course, these are not yet fully developed. However, I think they can play an important role also by they can really be an opportunity for trade unions, because trade unions could use these alliances to strengthen their expertise, their knowledge on environmental policies. And these alliances might also be crucially important for the public image of trade unions. Because if trade unions are associated in the public perception with polluting industries and with very narrow particular interests, this might become very difficult for unions to recruit new members, especially among the younger generations, which are more more concerned about climate change in general.
Well, I want to push that point a step further, the point you made about the alliances between environmentalists and trade unions. And this sounds like potentially a good development in Europe. Here, again, and give me a kind of a mirror, if you can, and a reflection on what it's like in Europe. Here, environmentalists generally, and I'm going to make a oversimplification of this, they generally say, look, everybody's going to have to suck it up. Workers are going to have to suck it up. If you work in the mining industry, yes, we will make sure there will be some support and some funding and retraining. And I'm going to come to retraining in a moment. But there's not really a coming to grips with real numbers. I, for example, believe that if you're a miner, say, and you're going to lose your job because they're shutting down a coal mine, if you're over a certain age, say 45, for example, which I'm using that number because folks at that age, if they've worked in a mining industry, say for 25 years, it's a lot harder to transition to something else, but you could make the number somewhere else if you wanted to. But anybody over that age should get full income support at the level they were earning for the rest of their working lives, and full pension and full health care. Now, I don't think any environmentalists here are contemplating that scale of support. What do you think is happening in Europe, and what's your view of that?
Yeah, the situation is, of course, much more difficult in the United States because basically social security institutions are much less developed. In the United States, your pension, your healthcare often depends on your employer. And I think that's also a big issue for mine workers in the US because they are depending for their retirement funds on the companies. Continued financing of their pension fund. Here, of course, the situation in Europe, in European countries, is slightly different. But what we have seen with the agreement in Germany around the coal phase out is that there has been basically an agreement also involving the coal miners unions around the need of a structured transition and a structured phase out with support for workers. So there are examples which show that it's possible to have a structured approach to decarbonization, to anticipate change, and to help people, but also regions, because coal regions are also often there are not many alternative employment opportunities in these regions. So these are also regions which are dependent on public investments to have some degree of economic diversification.
You make a very good point, and let's just spend a minute or two about this. One of the things that's striking to me is the way in which, at least again in the debate in the United States, and please tell me how you see it in Europe, people don't think of this in the macroeconomic sense, that this isn't just about helping the individual worker, but it's about supporting the whole community, the grocery store down the street from the factory that no longer has workers coming in at lunchtime. And you can think about all the ripple effects. I'm wondering if folks are grappling with that in Europe, because in the United States, I think people make that separation and they don't see those connections.
Yeah, there are now beginning to emerge a number of instances of agreements between trade unions, public authorities, and employers around decarbonization. There has of course been the example of coal miners in Germany. There is also the example of of mine workers in Spain, where there is. Where we witness attempts to develop a broader approach, taking into account the need for public support for workers who might get laid off, taking into account the need for training or for retraining, taking into account the need for public support for local economies and for economic diversification. So I think that's important to bear in mind because people, of course, are not only attached to their place of work, but they might also be attached and for very legitimate reasons to the place where they live, where their children are growing up, and they want to see some future also for their region of origin. And that's of course one of the aspects of decarbonization policies, which is crucial.
Yes, I remember actually the communities in the United States or the general political debate seeing no problem in telling auto workers whose plants were shutting down in Michigan that they could just go down to Texas, which for our audience obviously is hundreds, thousands of miles, and they could get another job there, no problem, because there would be a plant there. And people don't take into consideration that there's community effects. There's children who are going to school. Are you going to uproot them? And the whole nature in which these kinds of transitions really affect communities beyond the factory and the plant. Now, you mentioned retraining, and I do want to spend a couple of minutes on this because this is an area that I've focused on and written about a lot over the years. And I'm going to make a assumption and an assertion about the United States, and tell me what you think about Europe. Generally speaking, retraining in the United States has completely failed. And the two best examples of that are the retraining efforts that happened after the fall of the Soviet Union, when there were about 2 or 3 million workers within the Defense Department, generally in the military industries, that basically were going to lose their jobs because there was a tremendous drawdown of resources, thank God, because of the end of the Cold War. And the second are the retraining programs that have been set up to take care of workers who lost their jobs because of trade related agreements, especially NAFTA. If you think about the North American Free Trade Agreement, which passed and came into effect in 1993. And those failed for two reasons. One was there was never enough money invested in those programs, but perhaps more important, people were being retrained for jobs that either didn't exist, there was a fantasy about these jobs, or they paid significantly lower money, certainly in terms of benefits, because as you point out, the US doesn't have a broad benefit system. And if you end up all of a sudden working for a non union employer, installing solar panels, you're going to be earning a significantly lower salary compared to what you had. So I'm curious what your assessment is of retraining programs in Europe and the kind of support they've had in terms of actually getting people real jobs that pay similar wages.
Yeah, there are of course multiple examples of support programs for retraining, of linked to the whole history of deindustrialization in Western Europe. You have had multiple programs funding funding support measures starting in the 1970s, 1980s in Germany, in France, in the UK. And I think that that's indeed an important factor that needs to be taken into account now when we discuss about decarbonization, because many workers, especially in manufacturing industry, have already a large experience of restructuring, and this experience is often a difficult and a painful experience. And often the same buzzwords are used, that there are promises of retraining, there are promises of public investments, of regional economic diversification. And these promises are not always, they are not always kept. And I think that that's, of course, today a challenge because there's lived experience of economic restructuring in many European countries, also in Central and Eastern Europe, where people are just afraid of things to come because they have their own experience has learned them that changes are often difficult and that public policies do not always keep their promises. And this, of course, is also a factor which influences trade unions, because trade unions might have a preference, and understandably so, for defending presently existing unionized jobs rather than hoping to unionize future renewable industries. So that's is the whole context, which of course needs to be taken into account. Yeah.
Well, it's the reality that people end up in poverty in these new jobs. I mean, I get that there's a organizational union desire to keep those members because it is hard to organize new union members. Certainly in the United States, it's a little bit easier in Europe, but in the United States, it's very difficult because of employer opposition. I mean, there's a whole industry that's entirely devoted, a multi-billion-dollar industry, to breaking unions and preventing unions from organizing new members. And the real issue here then, kind of as our last part to talk about, is so this is nothing new in a certain way. The scale is completely huge, and it's so big, this transition, if you will, this fight over power, that it is making people realize what has happened to individual workers in individual industries time and again. And it's really the tyranny of the free market, the tyranny of capitalism, that the power remains in the hands of corporations and employers. And they come into communities, and I'm speaking mostly about the United States. So give me a reflection about Europe, if you will, after I finish my little rant here. They come into communities, they exploit them for whatever they can. They leave then and leave devastated communities behind. And there is no regime that tries to control them. Certainly, the government in the United States never tries to really restrain corporations in a big way. And certainly, CEOs make plenty of money. They're not the ones suffering. So it's essentially workers who are cast off. The difference here, and the reason we're having this debate, is the scale is not in just one or two communities or one industry. Now we're talking about essentially redoing the whole economy.
Yeah, and of course, with climate change, there's also an intergenerational dimension and an international dimension, because we are not just talking about the interests of the presently employed, but we are also talking about interests of future generations. And of course, we are talking about the interests of people in developing countries who will be exposed much more to the effects of rising temperatures than people in developed countries. So this makes climate change a much more complicated problem. And unions are here confronted with an issue where they have to take into account many different viewpoints. They have to take into account the interests of their present members. They also have to take into account the interests of their future members, who might also be in low carbon industries. They have to take into account the interests of workers in developing countries who might suffer much more from rising temperature, from heat waves.
Sure.
So this makes really this calls for a high degree of coordination also among trade unions, in order to enable them to go beyond the sole perspective of the presently unionized workforce.
Well, and to sum up and to wind down our conversation here, the alliance that you keep referring to could be very powerful. If you look at the environmentalists, especially powered by younger people, they're the ones pushing for, hey, we have to save the planet for our generations moving forward. The labor movement, unions can, on the other hand, say yes, but you don't want to save a planet where you're then going to be living in communities who are essentially struggling to survive because they can't make a living. And the alliance, therefore, is there to be built if you see the common enemy, which is global capitalism and the free market. And if you can change that and bring the power to bear to reform the economy, to put more power in the hands of people and the communities, and to depower, if I can use that word, corporate power. In the US, we have a problem actually just on the level of taxation, where rich people and corporations just don't want to pay taxes. In Europe, obviously, you have a different system, and it's a little better, if I can use that term. So there is that alliance that you've been referring to, as long as they see the common enemy.
Yeah, and yes, there's of course also the challenge that a number of unions tend to align with their employers,
Yes.
because there's of course also a pressure by employers who call upon unions to support their point of view. So that's also a big challenge. But I think that's one of the reasons why I think debate among unions is important, and the capacity also to coordinate among unions to get a broader point of view, because they are the interests of the workforce in high carbon industries, but there's also workforce in low carbon activities. And I think difficulties arise if unions are not able anymore to go beyond the sole perspective of a company or the sole perspective of an isolated industry. I think climate change typically calls for a broader perspective in alliance with environmental organizations, in alliance with the youth movement in favor of ambitious climate action.
And my actual final question, I think, although who knows, maybe I'll come up with one more, is about your Just Transition Fund. I want to give you a chance to explain, because that was the end of your paper and your analysis. What is the Just Transition Fund in your mind, and how would it work in its most simplest terms?
Yeah, the Just Transition Fund has been created within the EU recovery package and has now been adopted. And European trade unions have put a strong emphasis on this Just Transition Fund because obviously unions depend on or are counting on public support for decarbonization and on public support for job transitions and public support for public policies helping along with decarbonization. And so
would it actually fund retraining? Would it fund income replacement, or is it just to fund the setting up of the system? Where would the money come from?
The money is it's part of the European recovery package, and the Just Transition Fund. That's indeed an issue where European trade unions are keen to also to put forward policy proposals and to enter into a dialogue about what is to be done with this money, with these public funds of the Just Transition Fund. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time and for your analysis in this paper. And what I'm going to do is probably have you back, maybe your colleague Nadia, who could not join us today, but have you continue this conversation with us, because this obviously is going to be a emerging issue. It's going to continue to develop. And from the workers' standpoint, it's crucial that if they participate actively, certainly unions participate actively in this process, that workers are not left on the side of the road as we decarbonize and create a livable planet. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a pleasure.
That'll do it for this week's broadcast. Thanks to my guest, Adrian Thomas. Our editor, as usual, is David Hebden. Don't forget to throw us a little financial support. Go over to workinglife.org, look for the podcast tab, and click over there, and you will see a link to Patreon, where you can sign up as a one-time sponsor or a monthly supporter, or go over to Act Blue and look for Working Life with Jonathan Tassini. And there also you can become a one-time sponsor or a monthly sponsor. Hey, thanks for being with us. Look forward to having you back next week.